Hey everyone, welcome back. This is Long, and I'm here today to talk about the Diablo 4 patch notes that came out on June 27th. In it were a couple of changes, but the most significant one I felt was the instant teleport or teleport to Nightmare Dungeon directly, as opposed to you having to run out there on the map. Um, it was a great implementation, big win for Blizzard. So got into game like everyone else, and you know went through with it, right? Use a sigil, teleport it. However, I thought that I would be able to teleport directly into the dungeon, but instead it deposited me outside of the dungeon. So then I would have to then click on the dungeon to enter. Now, it's not that big of a deal. I just thought it was a little weird that it would trigger two loading screens, right? One loading screen to teleport to the dungeon, and then a second loading screen to when you click on the dungeon to actually enter. So I kind of looked into a little bit more, and I wasn't really the only one that felt this way. So I read a couple of posts on Reddit and the forums, and kind of what the player expectation of the behavior would be. Um, Now, given that if it was a design decision by the product manager or the developers, it's a very weird one. Instead, I think it's a little bit more nuanced. I think it had more to do with the technical limitation of what they're dealing with. What do I mean by that? Let's take a look. Okay, so I logged in and crafted a couple of sigils. So let's see, right? The patch notes say we can teleport directly there. So I'm going to turn this into a nightmare dungeon. And then it's a nightmare dungeon, right? Click on it, travel. Cool. So I teleport in there. Now I'm thinking, well, here's one loading screen. I'm thinking that it will teleport me directly into the dungeon. Instead, I'm still outside. And I have to click into the dungeon to go in. Now, kind of a weird behavior, right? The in that they can't teleport me directly into the dungeon. But I suspect what's happening is that using that sigil was just a simple was like a game client flag. It really doesn't really tell the server that this dungeon is a nightmare dungeon and keep it open, right? What I mean by that is, and to kind of illustrate my point, I'm going to use a spreadsheet to kind of show you guys, right? So we have this nightmare dungeon, and let's say this nightmare dungeon, it's the name of the dungeon, and here's the ID. And let's just say the ID, for simplicity's sake, is dungeon ID 1000, right? So you have these IDs. Um, this, what is this place called? Alderwood, right? I probably picked the worst one. So this is Alderwood. We have a couple of places like Whispering Pines. The ID could be 1001. Then we have the Gulron Slums, ID 1002, etc. Right? So you have these IDs, and I'm just gonna let it kill me, which is fine. Um, so you have all these IDs, and now what I mean by instance is that you have these instances, right? And the ID of the instance, and then you have the instance ID, right? So the instance ID is probably generated from these dungeons directly. So I'm in Elderwood right now. Um, it's probably going to be a instance ID of 1000, which means it's Alderwood, and then could be 001, right? So this is my game, right? That I'm in. Nobody else is in here. Now, if a friend of mine joins my party, joins my party and teleports to me or walks into the town portal, into the portal, or click on a dungeon, because I'm in the party, it's going to use this ID so that the game knows where to send my friend's character. They know that they know they need to send it to this particular dungeon with this questionable ethics, right? If it doesn't have this ID, the game doesn't know where to send you, right? So like if other people are playing, and there's millions of people playing, let's say for example, 002, this could be like Shroud's instance, right? If this was 1003, this could have been Asmongold's game, right? His instance, and so on, right? So how do we create a separation between these? Is that we need the specific ID for each instance. So this was actually Alderwood, right? So this is like Alderwood 001, Alderwood 002, etc., right? So the game, that's how the game knows. So that's the first step. The second step is that this dungeon was never created when the sigil was used. What do I mean by that? Okay, so I'm inside the dungeon. This instance is active. I'm going to go ahead and leave the game. Now, if I leave the game and I come back in my mind, the instance should still be active. I was only gone for what, literally 10 seconds, right? 20 seconds. Um, that instance should be open, specific to my game. What's going to happen instead? I think it's actually going to kick me out. I, as a player, think that it's going to keep me there, but instead, it kicked me out. And as you can see, that's no longer, the dungeon is gone. It's no longer a nightmare dungeon, right? What's happening is that because I'm a single player, there's probably some sort of command that basically says if there's nobody in the dungeon after a certain amount of time, or there's just nobody in the dungeon, or they leave the dungeon and there's no longer players there, shut down the instance, right? Get rid of that instance, and that's fine. But what's more interesting to me is that when you consume and turn a dungeon into a nightmare dungeon, this is actually the dungeon disappear. The nightmare dungeon, the nightmare version of this dungeon actually disappears if you log out. So what I mean by that is, let's turn this into a nightmare dungeon. This was Onyx Hold, right? So this basically is a flag telling the game that, hey, Onyx Hold is now a nightmare dungeon, right? I can teleport there, but I can't teleport inside. Well, because the instance isn't created yet, right? And we can demonstrate that. It teleports me to the dungeon, and inside of the dungeon, or outside the dungeon, I'm not in yet, right? It's still a nightmare dungeon. If I exit the game and I log back into the game, again, as a player, I would expect that the dungeon to be there. That the dungeon is still a nightmare dungeon because I just used my sigil 10 seconds ago. Well, look at this. Instead, the dungeon is no longer a nightmare dungeon. However, it also consumed my sigil. I don't have the sigil anymore. So what's happening is that when I use that sigil, if I'm not, especially if I'm not playing with friends, right? I'm just going solo here. When I use a sigil, the information that tells the game to create a nightmare dungeon, that is like a flag, like a little flag that says, Onyx Hold is nightmare dungeon true. Then when I click on it and enter, then it sends me to the servers with all the instances, creates an ID for me, and then applies the affix and so on. So if other people join my game, then we would have that instance ID. They can teleport directly to me, or they can teleport into my instance of the nightmare dungeon. It doesn't get mixed up with anybody else's. So let's go back to the original question, which was, why can't I use the sigil and teleport directly inside of the dungeon? Right? If I make Guran Slums a nightmare dungeon, I'm expecting to be able to teleport inside the dungeon directly. Well, it's because the instance was never created. There is no nightmare dungeon. The instance does not exist until I click into that dungeon. And as you can see earlier, even when I clicked into dungeon, if I leave the game and I'm the only player there, it actually shuts down my dungeon. So if you disconnect and you're playing by yourself, well, guess what? You just lost your dungeon, right? So if you're playing with other players, however, it still detects that the nightmare dungeon is active. It won't delete, right? It won't get rid of you. So hopefully that kind of answers questions on why we can't teleport directly to there. It just seems that it's a kind of a technical limitation of what Blizzard has, in their game, in their framework and architecture. Could this be corrected? Theoretically, yes. Maybe once I've used a sigil, consume the sigil, turn into Nightmare Dungeon, it holds an ID in place for me. But the problem with that is you're kind of using resources, especially if I as a player, never really step into the instance to begin with. You're kind of creating this extra space on the instance servers, and if the player never goes there, it's kind of you're spending resources, right? And now if you scale this up, imagine there's millions of people doing this, right? You can just spam a bunch of sigils and open a bunch of nightmare dungeons, and it's just a mess. So I can kind of see why they decided not to do that, to create instance for you on the creation or on the usage of the sigil. If we had that instance ID, I could probably say we could probably directly teleport into a dungeon instead of having two loading screens. But at this point in time, it doesn't seem to be the case. So that's kind of my interpretation, or at least explanation of what's going on and why we need two loading screens to get um, into the Nightmare Dungeon directly. This is still a win overall. I think it's a great quality of life. We don't have to run there, but you know, it's a little weird still, a little awkward. Um, with that said, yeah, let me know what you guys think on this explanation. Let me know if it makes sense. Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. Have a good one. Bye.